Hello, everybody, and welcome to Symmetry Live. This is Natasha Helfer, and it is January 8th of 2021. So happy New Year, everybody. We are hoping to have a somewhat short discussion on some of the things that have been transpiring these last few days in our country here in the United States. We find ourselves in a bit of a somber mood, as I'm sure many do. And I guess in particular, the thoughts we had, we come at Symmetry Live after our provider meetings. We've already had a lot of discussion amongst ourselves, but one of the things that we thought of as we were talking through our own feelings and ideas around what's been happening is that we here at Symmetry, we kind of hang our hat on our expertise of helping families and couples and people who are transitioning in faith cultures, which oftentimes leads to ideological differences, within the community that they're a part of, right? So if you're Catholic or Mormon or Jewish or Muslim, and then all of a sudden you're changing your beliefs or changing your point of view, you're more than likely going to face a lot of ideological differences, which then, of course, filters into relational conflict or relational misunderstandings or cutoffs even, or just, kind of some of the things that we see families struggling with. And we were talking about how a lot of what we do in our work with people in those situations is somewhat applicable to what we're seeing in political ideology, right? So I think all of us would probably agree that there have always been, from the history of our country and in the history of humanity, many ideological differences when it comes to politics and when it comes to leadership and ideas of how to run countries and how to run communities and all of that stuff. So as relational mental health, professionals and coaches and therapists, we were hoping to maybe add some thoughts that might offer some guidance or some ideas or some things that you could maybe talk about within your own family circles, as I think probably not many of us are immune to having differences of ideas in our family systems at some level, right? So most of us will have either in our very close circles, like with our own children or spouses or best friends, ideological differences, or if it's even wider, like extended family, maybe people you don't see as often or communicate with as often, but are still there. Most of us will have people on different sides of the aisle, whether it comes to religion and or politics. So that's where we're coming at today. But we do just want to, maybe before we get started, just honor the sense that this is a heavy week and that people are, I'm sure, dealing with these issues in different ways. And we hope to add to the edification of our healing versus the detriment to that. So hopefully we'll do today. I want to turn the time over just really quickly to our provider, Jenny, because she only has a few minutes to be able to share with us before she's got to run off to some appointments. But you had some great ideas today, and I know you come from a systemic training background yourself. So Jenny, take it away as far as some of your initial thoughts that can get us going on this conversation.
I don't know,
did we lose Jenny? Oh no. Did we lose Jenny just as we're trying to give her space?
I think that is what happened.
I think we did. Okay.
Oh, no.
And we are, so everybody knows, because there were several providers who weren't even able to join us today. We're planning on having this discussion again, probably in next week. So maybe Jenny will be able to join us at that point. All right, well, given what I just said, who else wants to pipe in? Anybody with some initial thoughts?
I think Tami should start with her self-care piece. I thought that was really good.
Thank you. Thank you for offering me, Lisa.
You can do some self-care now and say no, thank you.
We had a really great conversation in our provider meeting, that I got a lot of insight that I hadn't thought about before, but one thing that I had shared, because we were talking about our feelings with what had happened, and we're all feeling very sad and upset and angry and trying to really just get a sense of what was happening. And what I shared, and then I don't know, what I offered was like, I don't know if it was the right way to do things, but obviously we got into we're in this fight or flight feeling and emotion that's coming to us. And what I had to do is, I don't know a lot of the details that were happening because I was so angry. I was so upset. I was feeling so many things, that I just had to turn it off. Realize that first and foremost, that my well-being, is important, number one, and that it was causing physical pain to watch and see things that I couldn't control, that I couldn't help with, that I wasn't a part of, and realizing how important it is. Sometimes we just have to turn it off. We have to turn off conversations. We have to, and for me, in my experience, the last few days, I had to turn it off, and I had to minimize my bubble. We live in a time where our world is so small. 60, 70 years ago, we didn't know what was happening, in Washington, D.C., unless we read the newspaper or we received letters or we were on telephone conversations. And so we didn't get wrapped up emotionally in what was going on by what we were watching, unless we had the TV on. And I had to turn that off. And I had, one important thing is realizing that your well-being, is important, and do what you need to, whether that's shutting things off, or being in it, whatever, does that serve a purpose for you? And that's great. But if it's not serving a purpose for you, shut it off. Live in your own bubble of wherever you live. I'm here in Kaysville, Utah. I had my work to do, so I turned it off, and I put my time and attention to people that I know that I could help, in my coaching, in my massage, in my other body work that I do. And that served a purpose for me. And it made the anxiety and the depression and the sadness a little more bearable. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Just look out for you first, and tomorrow will be a new day. So and come back and reassess the situation. Now I'm probably in a place that I can probably look at it more and go back and have more conversations with it. But take the time and reassess, even if it's in baby steps, hour by hour, minute by minute. So
yeah. I really love so much of that. I mean, so much of that message from you, Tami, is about self-care and knowing your own limits, knowing your own kind of inner wisdom. And I think, what I would invite people to do is to think about what you just said from their own personality and their own idea of balance, right? So I think some of us, just because of our personality or how we're wired, we tend to, in conflict or in fear or whatever, to kind of go inward, right? And there can be something very protective and healing about that. Some people are wired a little differently and immediately want to, connect and, call people or get on social media and make a post and feel like they're doing something, or advocating for something. And so that is also can be a very healing endeavor. And I think that wherever we are wired, there's an invitation to also look at how we're not wired, right? So if all we're doing is out there, that maybe we can think, could I lean into the part of me that isn't as apt to be quiet, right? Or to go more inward. Or if I'm an inwardly type person, could I lean into the part of me that needs to connect or be more willing to look at this, in a more extroverted way. So I think that there's some really beautiful wisdom there in what you shared, Tami.
Well, and I also believe the importance of the reassessment, because you can't lean into something if it's too painful. Discomfort is a necessary thing for growth and evolving, and even pain is. We forget that pain is life, a part of life, and discomfort is a part of evolving and moving forward. Just like going to the gym, you work out, that there's going to pain's going to come from it, but you also know the bigger picture of it. And so I think just finding the balance of, where the suffering is, and if you're in that space of suffering, then you need to take care of yourself, but also be open to the fact that discomfort is a necessary part of life, and it can teach us and we can learn from it too. So.
Yeah. And I love what you said, like, it's been a few days. Usually in the moment, you're going to lean towards what you're most comfortable with. And so it's not until you have some time to maybe lean into something a little bit differently. No, I love that. Well, so one of the things that I wanted to bring up that I think is similar to the work we do in our group practice is, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of things that I find parallel to religious kind of communities. So a lot of talk about truth, right? A lot about, or a lot of like, I'm right, no, we're right. A lot of polarization, right? A lot of, kind of being on one side or the other, not a lot of room for the middle space. And what we know through those, through having worked with people in those kinds of religious contexts for decades now, is that it's very easy to stay stuck in polarization spaces. And we also know a lot of the kind of human, how human this is, right? Like these are very human dynamics. There's a lot of research out there on tribal dynamics, how we function as groups. Most people who've taken, psychology in high school or even in college, will remember some of the, like the Stanford, research project where they stuck a lot of students into, kind of a space for a few weeks, and some were in power and some were like some were the jailers and some were the jailees. And even though they weren't really jailers and jailees, how they, within just a few days or weeks, kind of really identified in those roles and started acting in ways that they wouldn't have normally acted in. So kind of mob mentality, like there's just so many psychological ways to kind of think about these very human dilemmas that we get ourselves into and how they can cause real havoc in our relationships and our lived experience with other people when we kind of stay in these, on one side of the aisle and not be willing to bridge that gap somehow. So I'd like to, I don't know if Lisa or Lindsay, if you have any thoughts initially about, I brought up a lot of possible tangents we could go on, but about some of the parallels that you see happening kind of in our political climate to what we have seen, having worked with our certain population for so long.
I can go really quick. I've noticed a lot in coaching people who maybe have a spouse or a family member that has a different ideology than them, and they have so much desire to change that person. And I always have to coach them like, you can't change another person's mind. Like you cannot change you can't change their behavior. You cannot change another person. You only have control over changing yourself and how you're reacting and responding to the situation that you're in. And so I think that's an important thing. And I don't know that we can, go out and teach the whole world that they can only be in control of themselves, because, when people feel like they're right, like you're talking about, we're in the right, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to sway everyone else to believe the way they do. And that's just not going to happen. So, again, we can't control those people either, but if we can remember to be responsible for our own reactions, responsible. I loved what you were talking about in our meeting about, like, it's our responsibility to look at both sides of the issue, to seek truth on both sides, and not just stay in our own bubble of our beliefs, and not stay in an echo chamber of keeping everyone around us that has the exact same beliefs that we do, because then we feel validated, but looking at all sides of everything and coming to our own conclusions, and then trying to be respectful and kind with boundaries to those that have other ideas, rather than seeking to change everyone to make them like ourselves, because that's not going to happen, and it's not fair. And why, honestly, why would we want everyone to be exactly like we are? That would be kind of boring.
You know, and I am going to, like, this wasn't actually even what I was advocating in our session, but, you know, just to say that the other side of that, to complicate it even more, is that, like, there's a power dynamic here that, like, if you are in a position where people have power, you know, like, for instance, you know, like if you're a woman or an LGBTQ person or a person of color, or, and the thing that the people around you are believing actually does you actual harm, right? Like, because they have power that you don't have. They have social power, or they have physical power, or they have social capital, or they have money, or they have positions in government, right? Like, that you wanting them to change their mind is a really valid thing, because that's very protective, right? Like, and so, but you still can't, right? Like, it's just one of those real unfairnesses of life that, like, you know, like, if your parents believe that your sexuality is wrong, you can't change their minds by arguing with them about it. And that sucks. And that, and so sometimes, again, the most important part of that dynamic of deciding how we're going to respond to it is about our boundaries, right? Like, having really, really firm boundaries with people who have beliefs that do you harm. And sometimes those boundaries might look like disconnecting. And sometimes those boundaries might be about connecting in very specific ways where you have a goal. But, and I think it was Natasha that brought up the point of how frustrating it can be to feel like you're the one doing all the work, right? Like, I am doing all of this work so that I can have a relationship with you, and you don't seem to be doing anything, right? And that, you know, like, we have to decide, well, how much energy do we have to put into that when we're not in a position of power, right? But the more power you do have, the more power that you have, like the more money, the more social capital, the more I feel like, just to be the people we want to be, we need to be using that power in ways that that disrupt the things that are causing harm to the people who don't have power, right? So, you know, like, no, we can't change anybody's mind, right? Like, we can't make them think a different thing. And it's really important that we accept that. We can still have a relationship with those people if we have the, you know, like, depending on our boundaries and our social capital and our resources. But that there is a real frustration in feeling like you're doing all this work and you don't get anything back from it.
And all these concepts that we're talking about have so many complexities within the concept, right? And so it's like, you know, when you think about boundaries, you know, and I see this a lot on social media, people will say something like, well, if this is going to be your position, then just unfriend me now, right? So, and that's a boundary, that they're placing a boundary. Like, if we're going to have this ideological difference, I'm not interested really in having a relationship with you. And so there's, you know, we're going to say, well, is that a bad thing to do, or is that a good thing to do? and that's complex. And then of course the critique of that has been called cancel culture, right? Oh, well, then you just can't, you know, or we have all these terms, you know, currently, like, you're a snowflake, or you're this, or you're that, you know, and so we have all these terms to kind of criticize that boundary placement. And usually when you understand context, you can see how in some situations that might actually be a very healthy way to deal with a certain situation, or if you're dealing with certain topics. I know, for example, you know, I've got a minority child that, you know, talks about, well, it's difficult to look at these political issues when this one issue really does affect my life, so I don't want to be a one issue voter, but this one issue kind of has to do with my particular rights, right? And my particular lived experience. So maybe their context is going to be different than somebody who comes at those issues maybe from a more a space where they're a little bit more separated, like those particular issues aren't going to affect their personal life as much. So I think that even in something like, oh, you should or you shouldn't unfriend people from Facebook, is complex. It's not a yes or no answer, right? It's not, it depends on a lot of different things. And I think that's where we lack, we're not necessarily good generally in our, I think that's a learned skill more than a natural skill, right? To learn how to tolerate nuance, how to tolerate middle groundedness, how to tolerate or how to learn how to be a yes and type of person. I think that our instinctual selves are more about defending our safety and our turf. And therefore, that's where that black and white binary approaches come from. It's not because we're inherently bad people or mean or uneducated or those things. It's we all come wired with this very defensive kind of survival instinct that serves us well at times, however, not often. Oftentimes what we're better served by are these learned skills that have to do with emotional intelligence, right? And so that is difficult because it doesn't come as naturally. It takes self-awareness. It takes this willingness to do work that is uncomfortable, like Tami mentioned, being comfortable with uncomfortable. And all of us are in different spaces of where we're at on that journey, depending on a myriad of factors. Right. Lisa, were you going to say something?
Well, and I think that that's another thing that I know has taken me a long time to learn is that, like, if you see somebody handling their boundaries or their situation in a different way, it can be sometimes really hard to not judge it, right? Like to be like, oh, I'm not sure that's emotionally mature or healthy, or right? Like to sort of be like, oh, well, maybe in their context, that's what they need to do. So, like recognizing that, like, it's complex for you, it's complex for everybody. We're all in different places in the way that we're trying to navigate this. But I do think, I mean, coming from a, like a strengths perspective, I do think that, like, we as, like practitioners and as our audience, who are probably the primary people watching us, like we, I think, are in a particularly excellent position to really understand how to bridge these divides. Like people who have been raised their whole life completely surrounded by either all conservative or all liberal or all religious or all not religious people, right? Like I think that they struggle more to understand what this middle way might look like. Whereas, those of us who live every day in this middle way place where we're trying to navigate between family members and other family members or friends, or right, because we have so much experience trying to navigate between groups, that like probably everybody who's watching this is in a much better position to sort of like be the change we want to see in the world, because through like these experiences of being raised in a spiritual in maybe a spiritual tradition that we've had to navigate changes through, right? Like that gives us a lot of like understanding for what that might look like in a political realm, or what that might look like in a societal realm. I don't know. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, I like that. I thought we could give some tips, because it's one thing to talk about these things kind of from a abstract or kind of general way versus, okay, that sounds great, but how does the rubber hit the road per se? So I would like to start off with, kind of some of the tips that I give a lot of couples, which is kind of looking at the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or relational apocalypse, from John Gottman's work, right? So which are, he's done a lot of great research on the fact that if you have a lot of criticism in your relationship, if you have a lot of defensiveness in your relationship, if you have a lot of contempt in your relationship, and if you do stonewalling in your relationship, those are kind of the 4 things that fairly predictably mean that the relationship is probably not going to be sustainable in a healthy way, and actually leads to their underlying reasons for a lot of what we see in divorce in particular. So I'd like to kind of apply that to some of these political conversations that we're having. So an example of criticism, for example, is, criticizing the person instead of criticizing kind of like the behavior or the idea, right? And so that's kind of a very simple, instead of saying, well, you're just a loser, I can't believe you voted for this person or that person, I can't believe that you would even think that way. You can criticize the behavior, like, I don't like it when you speak to me in a certain tone, or I don't like it when, or this idea that you adhere to, I don't like, that's different than saying you are an awful person. The idea maybe doesn't sit well with me. And these are maybe some of the reasons why, and this is why I have a hard time understanding your perspective or whatever. So,
can I kind of, there are a couple of particular criticisms that we go to, I think. So when we're, like the ones I see a lot around politics are, you're stupid, right? Like only stupid people believe that. You're uneducated or ignorant. You're a bad person. Those are the big ones that I see, that like, there's just no way to continue to have a conversation with someone if you're telling them they're stupid, they're ignorant, or they're bad, right? Like, you can open up an invitation to learn something new without telling someone that they're ignorant, right? And like, stupid and evil are pretty much non-starters.
And I would add to those too, like, you don't care about me, right? So it's personal. Like, if you voted for that person, that means you don't care about me, or, you don't love me. Any other critiques that you feel like are typical out there, Lindsay or Tami, that you hear often being kind of thrown at each other that shut down conversations?
I know, pretty much the stupid, that's what I see the most of. Or just the blanket idea that if you voted for so-and-so, then we can't even be friends. I can't even, you're not worthy of my friendship, basically.
You don't belong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think you touched really good on the main things that are out there that I see.
Right. And I think that, some the ways to kind of, is really, again, to focus on the behavior, focus on the instead of the person's character or the person themselves, focus on what's problematic about it. And I think it's always very powerful when we share something personal, so I feel, because again, people can argue ideas all day long. You can't really argue another person's feelings or another person's lived experience, so if you can share, like, this is why I struggle with that, or this is my perspective on that, or I feel hopeless, or I feel scared, or I feel sad. Now you're eliciting empathy, you're eliciting connection, and it's easier to hear, even if we're still not going to agree at the end of that conversation on everything, or maybe even nothing, there still will be a relational component that was salvaged, right? That can at least help you feel like, well, at least that person was willing to listen, or at least that person was willing to say something like, well, I could see how that might bother you. That's not necessarily agreement, but it is that bridging kind of concept. The next one that I'll talk about is defensiveness, right? And I think one thing that I see a lot of that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is when somebody brings up a valid complaint, like, hey, I'm really worried about blah, 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 blah. And let's say, I say that on the Democrat side or on the Republican side, a very normal response I hear all the time, a very defensive, normal response is, yeah, but the other side does that too, right? or the other side did this, 2 years ago, and so instead of focusing on that one valid issue or complaint, we're now off to the races, talking about the 500 things, 500 other things. And so I think that can be very dismissive. That can feel very dismissive, and it can feel very frustrating because we can't even stay on topic, right? So, and it's usually true. I mean, yeah, there's all kinds of ridiculousness on all kinds of sides of all kinds of issues. At the same time, can we try to offer the respect of staying on point with whatever the complaint is in that moment, and then if you have other complaints, you can bring that up later instead of tangenting away. Is that
Yeah, in general, I kind of like to have a meta conversation sometimes when a conversation is hard, and the meta conversation just means a conversation about the conversation. So if you're wanting to bring up something like that and you don't want it to be derailed, you can even head that off at the pass by saying, I understand that my side has also been guilty of things like this sometimes, but I would really like to have a conversation about this and not get caught up in the weeds of the ways that my side has been guilty. But if you want to have that conversation about the way my side has been guilty, I'm willing to have that, but I would just like it to be in a different conversation, right? Set the purpose of the conversation and focus it in.
Yeah, right.
And I think if you're the one doing the listening to someone, rather, if you're put in the place where you want to be defensive like that, just remembering that we all have the human need to want to feel heard. And as much as you want to make your point, but it's not even going to be heard because you're cutting that other person off. So if you give them the chance to feel listened to and heard, then later on, like Lisa was saying, you can have the conversation about what you want to bring up, and they'll be a lot more willing to probably listen to you if they felt like you listened to them.
And that's like a basic emotional intelligence interoceptive thing of trying to notice when that defensiveness rises up in you, to really feel, notice what it feels like when you get hooked and you want to and then some ways of self-soothing so that you can come back to focusing on the person you're trying to listen to. That is a really hard but valuable emotional intelligence skill.
I love that. So the next one would be contempt. And this is the classic, kind of the best way to explain contempt in my view is the eye roll. Kind of it's this kind of sense of superiority. My position is so much better than your position, obviously, right? And so how this is so ridiculous. And I'm very guilty of this. I mean, I do eye rolls very well. I've been challenged to think about my whatevers, whatever, and I do those kinds of, so that's a form of contempt, because it's I'm so frustrated, or I'm so, I'm so unwilling to see your perspective, and I really actually do see my perspective as superior, that I'm going to treat you with this kind of disrespect that we call contempt, right? And it doesn't mean that you can't have conviction, and you can't have ideas that you feel are in a sense kind of superior or worthy of your commitment or your ideas, but it's how you treat then the other person's equal right to kind of have their perspectives as well, if that makes sense.
They're dumb perspectives.
Because they're stupid.
They're stupid perspectives.
It's so important to put yourself in that position, because all of us have been on the other side of that contempt, and how dismissive and demeaning, and it just feels horrible. And it's just a horrible feeling. So if going into conversations, you can think about that, be like, okay, I've got to remember that doesn't make people feel good. And again, that's not going to make them be remotely responsive to what I'm trying to say. Then hopefully it can help us dial that back and tone it down and be compassionate in the way that we share our points of view.
And just to meta conversation this a little bit, this is really about deep conversations with people that right? These are about people with whom you want to have a relationship. Right, there are different tools for conversations with people that are in a position of power over you, or in a, right, like the rules are different depending on the context of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're being treated with contempt by someone who is in power over you, the rules of the conversation are a little bit different than if you're treating somebody you're married to or your mother like with contempt, you know. So
yeah, thank you for that distinction. All right, and then the last one is stonewalling, which typically happens when people are flooded or when there's a history of some of these other three, horsemen per se. So people can get to a point where they shut down pretty quickly. It's like, we've kind of trained, if we have a conflictual relationship in general, we've trained
mute.
And so stonewalling can just kind of be like deer in the headlight looks, not really engaging, even excusing yourself from the conversation, but in a way that's very dismissive, like I'm not even going to talk to you about this. Checking out, it's kind of a checking out process. And so being on the other side of that, again, feels very dismissive, very problematic, very hopeless, like we're not ever going to be able to resolve these things. And I think one of the things that Tami was talking about is really important because what helps with this is time and timeouts per se, and coming back to conversations when you're less triggered, right? So being able to maybe, instead of just stonewalling in a way that is unhealthy, actually being more intentional about needing a break. So that's calling a timeout, saying, I need a break from this conversation. I'd love to pick this up again tonight or tomorrow. But at this point, I just need to kind of take care of my own physiology. I can feel myself, kind of shutting down. It's always good to take a time out on yourself, not on your partner. Like, you're out of control, you're crazy, you need a timeout, right? It's more like, I'm struggling, I can feel myself shutting down, I don't think I'm being my best self right now, I can feel myself getting defensive, I need a timeout. Can we come back to this? And we know physiologically that takes at least 20 minutes for our heart rate and our ability to kind of think through things in less polarized ways. Takes about 20 minutes at least. So I usually recommend a 20-minute to 2-hour break, ideally.
And if you are the person who is flooded, to recognize that like that 20 minutes, if you're, like walking in circles, talking yourself up into that, like if you're not taking a break from the conflict in your head and you're still like, then that isn't going to take 20 minutes because you're not giving yourself an actual break, right? Like you can't just step away, go off arguing it in your mind and going in circles on the hamster wheel and then come back 20 minutes later, right? Like you're still going to be in that flooded place. You have to really take a break. Like you have to reset your brain, do some deep breathing, bring yourself down into a more parasympathetic response.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one thing to keep in mind, Lisa, as we were talking before we came on this session, is knowing how different people's personalities are. Like I am a feeler, and so I get flooded really often in intense conversations, not being able to verbalize or communicate clearly because I am so overwhelmed with the sensations in my body versus, so I'm going to be a type of personality that's probably going to need to take those timeouts a little bit more, or at least let these people, let the people I'm having conversation with saying, I'm feeling a lot and it's clouding my thinking. I need to be able to, I need to have that space to be able to think more clearly, to be able to communicate better, because I get lost in my emotion. And, and then there's, for example, Lisa was saying, hey, she wasn't even able to be able to feel emotion, right? In her way that she grew up. So she is able to sit very comfortably in that. And so acknowledging that we're all, well, maybe not comfortably.
Let me explain, because
you have, so you go on and explain, but acknowledging how you are in those, and acknowledging other people, and that's going to be different, and and knowing that there's just differences in all the ways.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah. So me growing up, we weren't allowed to have emotions. So I will go into this like hyper logical, like almost robot thing where I'll talk faster and louder and maybe even talk over you, which I even did once earlier today over Natasha, where I'm just like, no, I'm so passionate. I need to tell you all my words. Right. And
I never
no. But I would like to be clear that it isn't any more reasonable or less emotional than what you're going through. And I think it gets labeled that sometimes, right? Like I just had this with a couple who came in, they were like, oh, well, she's always really reasonable when we're arguing and I can't, I have to shut down. And I'm like, you're not, like you are feeling just as many emotions as he is. It's just that your response is different. And so this story of like, oh, I'm more comfortable in it, or I just have a different response. And I'm not being any more rational or reasonable than anybody else. It's just that like, I learned to talk really fast and make really good arguments in order to survive. And so I like the feelings are all still there and they're not any more reasonable than anybody else's feelings.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love how you shared it's the response, and also how Natasha talked earlier about these are things that we can learn how to do if we have more awareness and mindfulness, and coming back to, okay, I need to take my deep breath. But yes, thank you for acknowledging.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you've ever been in a relationship with someone who talks faster when they're upset, you will understand that it is not fun. Like that is not a fun thing.
Are you saying something about me, Lisa?
Well, I mean, I was talking about myself, but if it applies, maybe you can think about it and reassess.
I think that, and this is why, to Tami's point, when she said, I might be one that likes to call the timeout and say, I need a break. I just want to honor that being on the other side of that, when you're the talker and you don't want the break, that can feel really hard to honor that timeout. And why in my couples work, I actually hold the timeout caller responsible for bringing the conversation back. Because otherwise, if you have a withdrawer, who's just like, oh, it's timeout, and then they never come back to it, that's also unfair to the person who's really wanting that connection or resolving, right? So, so it's just an important thing to make sure you're mindful of. I absolutely have a right to call a timeout. I also need to respect that other person's, probably desire to reconvene and try again and things of that nature. All right.
And hopefully they're talking less fast when we reconvene.
Yeah, right. All right. So that's Gottman stuff. The last two things I'll want to say really quickly, and I think maybe it was Lindsay who started off with this earlier on, but can we all be willing and commit ourselves to listen to something or read something that doesn't fall in our typical kind of resourcing type of area, right? Because we do know, and this has been a complaint, and we've talked about it on this show many times, that confirmation bias is real. As humans, one of the things that we really like is being agreed with. and finding people similar to us, right? We see this in racial dynamics. We see this in cultural dynamics. We see this in socioeconomic dynamics. And there's real danger in that because then, certain groups rise to power over others and, all of that stuff. Plus, it's just personally dangerous because we can get caught in we think we're all so smart, but we're all affected by these things. So we're not immune. Level of intelligence does not make you immune to this. And the only thing that makes you immune to this is being willing to diversify your portfolio, right? Whatever that portfolio is. And so even if it's hard to listen to a different perspective, even if that different perspective is offensive, even if it's something you're not used to, it's good to practice sitting with a different point of view, point of view that you find not as palatable. And the research has shown, you know, when the internet came out, there was all this hope that, oh, now we're going to be able to, you know, have tons of ideas out there and people are going to be educating themselves on so many different points of view. And what we've actually found out is that people actually find their own little groups, just like you do in your rural community or in your whatever. And they don't really do a lot of diversifying. Even though there's a lot of information available, they'll find the information that already confirms their own ideas, confirms their own bias, helps them feel better about themselves and agree. And although there's usefulness in that, I think we all do need spaces where we are agreed with, where people get us, where people understand us. We also need to be open to things that are very different. So that would be a challenge I would put out there. I think we would all agree with that. And
I have a quick tip, just because this one worked on me, because as a talker, my husband was the, you know, more Tami's like, I need a break kind of. And early on in our marriage, when I was like really convinced I was right and I was arguing with him about something, he would just ask me like, how do you know? I mean, like these questions of just like asking people for more information about what they're arguing, like, how do you know? Or where'd you get that information? Or like just really simple questions can really, like it challenged me. Anyway, it challenged me to really think about where I was getting my information.
And again, to do that in a non-contemptuous way, right? Like, well, how do you know? Or, you know, where are you getting that information is different than, well, tell me more about that. Or where did you hear that? Or what's the sources around that, you know, in a more respectful manner.
Yeah.
It'd be very helpful. The last thing, because I know we all need to go, the last thing I'll just bring up is I will say that people in the middle oftentimes pay a price. So when you are trying to be a bridge builder, I know we see this a lot in people who are in religious communities who are kind of like they're not leaning towards the orthodoxy of their religion, so they disagree with maybe some of the more prominent religious narratives in that space. And they're still trying to, you know, find space in there for their own way of wanting to live their faith or their religious practices or their spirituality. And they're also not out. They haven't left, you know, they haven't necessarily, you know, made a stance. And so what happens to those people is now that there's two groups that are upset with them, right? And I kind of see this, I know that we've kind of tried to stay away from naming certain politicians or whatever, but we kind of see this with Mitt Romney currently, right? Or some of the, and we've seen it with Democrats as well in the past, but, you know, he's kind of making a middle stance. And so people on this side will criticize him, well, but you're still complicit, you know, you still, you know, like there's Democrats or whatever that would say, who cares that you are bridging, you're still complicit, et cetera, et cetera. Stop, doggy. And then on the other side, it's like, you're a traitor, you know, like you've left us, you're not towing the line. And so being in the middle typically is just, it's hard. It can be lonely and it can be difficult. And if you're the one in your family system or in your community trying to be a bridge builder, I just want you to know that we honor that difficulty of having to choose a side, and the fact that people will get angry at you if you don't stay in one of those kind of polarized spaces. Any thoughts on that before we end?
The struggle is real.
Struggle is real.
Just amen to that. I'm just getting emotional to that because I feel it. So yeah, it can be very lonely, but in reality there's so many people like you that are in that same space. So
yeah, we're all huddled together on the bridge.
And don't even know that we're there with each other.
Right. And I mean, even though I do think that any movement, any ideology does need kind of people to be very adamant and strong, it's usually the middle people where the change happens. You know, you need those kind of more polarized positions so that you can even have a middle
Mhm.
where the change happens. But in general, there's so I just want to say that there's value to being on any of those.
Yeah. There is, and I think, but I mean, I know that I feel a particular calling to always being on the bridge, and it is, like I sympathize with the people on the either side almost. I mean, that's the point of being on the bridge, I guess. Like I can see what calls you over here, and I can see what maybe calls you over here, and so it's not that I disagree necessarily that with where you've been called. It's just that's not where I feel called.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. This has been Symmetry Live on January 8th of 2021, where we're all dealing with many, many things. And I just want to thank my team for joining me today. We've got Lindsay Hyde. She is one of our wellness coaches coming to you from Colorado. We've got Lisa Butterworth, who is one of our coaches and therapists coming to you from Boise, Idaho. And Tami Harris, also one of our wellness coaches coming to you from the Salt Lake City area in Utah. And so we all, are in the business of helping relationships and individual growth. And if you want to find out more about us or whether or not you'd be interested in reaching out to us for further help or resources, you can do that at symmetrysouls.com, which we'll link to here in the comments. And otherwise, I hope, and we offer services, just so everybody knows, both in office and online. Not so much in office these days with COVID, but in general, we oftentimes will meet with people either in office or online, whether through video or telephone or chat. So there's lots of options to reach out to get help. And if we're not a good fit, we're always willing to help you find a good fit outside of us. So hope everybody has a healing week, healing conversations, healing spaces to deal with the many, I think, unknowns and ambiguities that many of us are feeling these days. So,
well, and that would be a good thing to put on the list of coping, right? Like, yes, we sometimes have to go into difficult spaces and have difficult conversations, but maybe, like you don't just have to seek out the difficult conversations. Finding a group of people to talk to about the things that are hurting is also important, that they can really sympathize.
absolutely. Yeah. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah.